Let's talk about numbers in Python. And we're going to learn how we can work with them. First of all, there are two primary types of numbers that Python works with and understands and makes a distinction with. In other words, it views integers differently than floats. These are the two types we're going to talk about. For example, it may allocate different memory for an integer versus a float. So it depends on the level of precision you need. But again, Python will automatically detect the type based on how you define a variable. Same way that we saw earlier in the course with strings and integers. If we have quotes around a variable value, it detects it as a string. If we, in the same sense, with integers, those are whole numbers. In other words, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even negative numbers, negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, negative 10, etc. And so if we create a variable called myInteger and assign it a value of 1, that is a whole number. So Python will define that as type int, integer. A float, on the other hand, is any fractional number or rational number that's has a decimal in it. That's one way that we can see that in most cases this is a way to see that a number is going to be a float, is if it has a decimal. So my float equals 1.0. It's the same value. 1 and 1.0 is the exact same value, right? However, Python views those as different types because this float, has a decimal. And lastly, and we'll show some examples here, results of operations involving an integer and a float will be a float. So if we have my integer and my float, my integer plus my float, it will be of type float. So let's show some examples here. My integer equals, let's just say my integer equals 5. And then if we look at the type of my integer, that is an int, right? So Python auto detects that it's an integer because there's no decimal. There's also no quotes around this. It's a whole number. So it's not a float. It's not a string. It's an int. Now, if we define my float, let's say 2.0. So we have a decimal here. Type my float. What is the type of my float, that variable? It is type float, as we expected, because there's a decimal there. Now, if to conclude this segment, if we create another variable, let's call it result, and assign it the value of my integer plus my float, so 5 plus 2.0, as we learned by checking the type, that will be a float. Adding an integer or any operation involving an integer and a float will result in a float.